Welcome everybody to the third webinar of the GHG platform webinar series. My name is Merlin Francis and I'm from the communication team at CSTEP. The GHG platform is a civil society initiative providing independent estimation and analysis of GHG emissions. The platform is an initiative supported by the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation and includes consortium members CEEW, ICLAIR South Asia, Vasudha Foundation, WRI as well as CSTEP. CSTEP will be anchoring today's session, which will focus on trends in India's GHG emissions against key indicators such as population, GDP, and energy. This will be followed by each of the consortium members findings in key economic sectors such as energy, industries, waste, and the FOLU sector. A few rules before we begin. We request you to mute your computers while the webinar is in progress. Each of the partner organizations will present their findings. Each presentation will be about 7 minutes. The webinar will then be followed by a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Use the chat window. There's a Q&A chat window that's available on your computers to direct questions at respective sector experts. Purnima Kumar from CSTEP, a research analyst at CSTEP, will begin today's webinar. Purnima is a research analyst at CSTEP. Her work has looked primarily at different aspects of national and international climate policy through projects such as the GHG Platform India. She is also currently looking at energy pathways for meeting India's developmental goals with a focus on housing and infrastructure. Purnima has a background in architecture. She holds a master's degree in environmental and infrastructure planning from the University of Groningen. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in carbon management from the University of Edinburgh. Before CSTEP, Purnima worked at the Center for Sustainable Technologies at IISc Bangalore. I now invite Purnima to give an overview of the platform and present CSTEP's analysis of the energy sector.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start by telling you about the GHG Platform India. The GHG Platform India is a collective civil society initiative providing an independent estimation and analysis of India's greenhouse gas emissions across key sectors such as energy, waste, industry, and agriculture, forestry, and land use change. As mentioned, the platform comprises CEEW, CSTEP, ICLAIR South Asia, Vasudha Foundation, CIMMYT, and WRI India, in addition to a few sectoral experts in their individual capacities. The platform was jointly conceptualized by Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, who's our funder, and Vasudha Foundation, the platform secretariat. The GHG Platform India was formed as the culmination of processes that occurred on the sidelines of COP20 in Lima in December 2014. The first phase of the GHG Platform India looked at national emissions. This was expanded upon in the second phase, level emissions estimates from 2005 to 2013. Now, in the third phase of the GHGPI, we have expanded our time frame up to 2015. We are also assisting certain state governments with revising their SAPCCs to align with our nationally determined contribution goals. The objectives of the platform are multifold. We aim to create a starting point to track GHG emissions. We also hope to facilitate greater understanding on how GHG emission trends have evolved at both the national and state levels. In doing so, we hope to help relevant stakeholders identify opportunities to establish climate mitigation goals, and in the process also showcase India's actions on climate change. In terms of data, we are attempting to address gaps in greenhouse gas data availability at the national and subnational level, and also make data more accessible by making it available on a single platform. Our objective, ultimately, is to help inform policy dialogue and decision-making. Our efforts in doing so were recently recognized by the MOEFCC in India's second biennial update report to the UNFCCC. Now, to provide broader context to our GHG emissions and our national goals to reduce them, India ratified the Paris Agreement in 2016. In our nationally determined contribution, or NDC, to the UNFCCC, we volunteered to reduce our emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% over 2005 levels, achieve 40% fossil-free power generation capacity, and create a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2e by 2030. At present, our energy sector emissions account for more than 70% of our overall emissions, and we are one of the top 5 highest GHG emitters in the world. Moving on to a broad level summary of India's GHG emissions over the past decade or so, Our emissions have increased from about 1,500 to 2,400 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. We see that the energy sector is a key driver of emissions in India, accounting for 59% of its emissions in 2015. As a growing economy, still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, our energy sector's share in emissions have also risen, as has the industry sectors. Now we'll take a look at how India's emissions have been doing with regard to key indicators like GDP, energy, and population. Our overall emissions intensity of GDP declined between 2005 and 2015. If you look at our COP15 reduction targets for 2020, you'll see that we've achieved about 14% reduction as per our calculations. This reduction can be attributed to the influx of renewable energy and other low carbon technologies in both demand and supply sectors during this period. Our emissions per capita have increased by about 40% during this period, due largely to urbanization, rising income, and growing aspirations. At 1.87 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita, we're still far below the world average for 2014, which was 4.97 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. Now that we've looked at key indicators for India's emissions at a broad level, let's look at them sector-wise, starting with the energy sector. The energy sector's emissions intensity of GDP has reduced by nearly 6% over the past decade. Our energy intensity of GDP has also gone down significantly, while our emissions intensity of energy has increased. So what we can see is that this increase in emissions intensity of energy has been compensated for by the reduction in energy intensity of GDP and has led to an overall reduction in emissions intensity of GDP. If you look over at our emissions intensity of energy for the energy sector, you'll see that we've been growing at a CAGR of about 17% over the 2005 to 15 period. The main drivers for this change are transport and public electricity generation, which is abbreviated here as PEG. In the PEG subsector, coal has always been the most significant fuel, taking up a 76% share in 2015. Between 2007 and 2011, the share of natural gas consumption increased, and so the relative share of coal consumed reduced, but later picked up again after 2012. In the transport sector, greenhouse gas emissions have doubled, but emissions intensity of energy has stayed more or less constant. Looking at public electricity generation now, our NDC target for fossil-free installed capacity is 40% by 2030. Since 2005, our overall fossil-free installed capacity has increased from 38 gigawatts to 86 gigawatts. As of 2015, we had achieved about 31% installed capacity. Owing to an increased penetration of renewables, fuel shifts, and energy efficiency measures, our grid emission factor has reduced gradually to 0.87 kg CO2e per kilowatt hour. This number is expected to further reduce with policies that are currently in place to increase RE capacity by 2022. So let's look at transport now. Emissions in the transport sector are driven primarily by road transport. If you look at the graph on the left, you'll see that there was a massive increase in the number of registered passenger vehicles between 2005 and 2015, which is nearly quadrupled. This correspondingly has caused emissions from the transport sector to nearly double. Another contributing factor to our increase in emissions intensity is the group of subsectors referred to as other sectors by the IPCC. This comprises residential, commercial, agricultural, and fisheries-related energy. If you look at the activities that contribute to GHG emissions from the other sectors, you'll find that cooking accounts for over 90% of it. Over the past decade, partly due to governmental push towards LPG and cleaner cooking, as well as improved access to LPG, biomass consumption for cooking has reduced and LPG consumption has nearly doubled. LPG consumption in absolute terms is still much lower than biomass because it's a more efficient fuel. But since biomass is considered carbon neutral and LPG is a fossil fuel whose emissions factor is much higher than biomass's, the emissions intensity of energy of the cooking sector has increased overall, despite the fact that cooking has become cleaner in terms of indoor air pollution. In conclusion, 2005 is significant to our emissions inventory because it's the baseline year for most of our emissions reduction targets. Between 2005 and 2015, growth in emissions from the power sector reduced because of a conscious shift towards low carbon technologies. With this in mind, we'd like to bring your attention to 2 points. One, there are many policies at the national level post 2015 that are aligned with our NDC targets, which could significantly alter how our emissions look in the future. And two, sectors like PEG and transport need to be focused on and decarbonized in order for us to be able to achieve our NDC targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Purnima. I now request Tirtha Biswas from CEEW to present his insights about the manufacturing sector emission estimates. Tirtha Biswas is a policy analyst at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, working on the development of sustainable and competitive pathways for Indian industry to support its low carbon growth aspirations. At the Council, his research revolves around mineral resource security, greenhouse gas emissions, and energy efficiency of the domestic industrial sector in India. Over to you, Tirtha.
Thank you, Merlin. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is Tirtha here. So today I'm going to talk about the broad level trends which we have observed in the manufacturing sector emission estimates. So if I talk about the approach, so industrial sector emission estimates have used a bottom-up approach, looking at energy consumption reported by more than 80 plus fuel types and across more than 2 million manufacturing enterprises. So the primary source of our data was the annual survey of industries as published by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, MOSPI. So without further ado, I'm going to take you through the numbers that we have found. Merlin, next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So if you look at the emissions, the industrial sector emissions increased from 341 million tons in 2005 to 635 million tons in 15, increasing with a CAGR of 6.4%. At a sectoral level, what we found, the two big sectors are iron, steel, and non-metallic minerals, primarily cement, are almost equally contributing to the industrial emissions. In terms of type of emissions, industrial emissions is primarily driven by fuels, which is the bulk of it is primarily created by coal, which is responsible for more than 80% of fuels emissions. Whereas in terms of IPP emissions, majority of the emissions are driven by the process emissions involved in the cement production. Next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of the various trends and drivers, we mainly focused on the energy use emissions, and while we looked at the national level, also looked at a different subsectoral level. So I'm going to start with the emissions intensity. At a national level, and at the economic, at the overall industrial level, what we saw is the intensity decrease with a CAGR of 2%. That roughly amounts to a net decrease of 13% compared to 2007 numbers. Now, you might be seeing why we are starting 2007, because emissions intensity are typically, you see a lot of fluctuations because we are looking at tons of CO2 per million of INR expenditure units. So what we have done is we have used a 3-year moving average to normalize that. Now, at a subsectoral level, what we saw is non-metallic mineral sector, which is cement, and non-ferrous mineral sector show the largest decrease in the emissions intensity. Whereas the only one sector that shows an increase is iron steel. Now, emission intensity is hard to understand without analyzing the drivers of it. So what we have done is we have looked at carbon intensity of the fuel which these sectors are consuming, and the energy efficiency of the processes from this sector. Next slide, please. So when looking at the carbon intensity, which has been expressed as tons of CO2 per TOE, at the overall industrial level has remained invariant, which roughly amounts to a 1% increase over the time period. At a subsectoral level, we saw two sectors standing out, which is chemicals, which decreased at a rate of -10%. The reason for decrease of chemical sector is what we found out is the increasing share of natural gas in the sector's energy mix. Whereas for food and beverage sector, the increase in carbon intensity is primarily because they're more reliance on coal as a principal source of energy demand. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in terms of energy intensity, what we have seen is a very similar pattern with the emissions intensity. And also it explains, right, if any carbon intensity remains constant, the only thing that's changing your emission intensity is the energy intensity. So at the national level, again, we see a similar CAGR of 2% and a net decrease of minus 14%. And whereas again, similar over here, we are seeing non-metallic minerals standing out, showing the highest decrease of energy intensity improvements, followed by food and beverage sector. And iron steel sector, again, is the only sector that showed an increase. Now, one may argue that the Bureau of Energy Efficiency has implemented the PAT scheme during the later period, which is from 2012 to 2015, and PAT also covered iron steel sector. Now, why don't we see an impact of PAT? So to explain the reason, can I go to next slide, please? Yeah. So one plausible explanation that we found, that I've seen over here, is the low coverage of PAT industries. That is the primary reason why we are not seeing the impact of PAT on the entire industrial sector. Now, over here, I have put out the data from the annual survey of industries. This is basically the cumulative energy consumption graph, where number of factories is on the x-axis and the cumulative energy consumption is on the y-axis. Now, out of the four sectors, the only sector where PAT covered around 80% of the sector's total energy is non-ferrous metals. However, if we go back and recall, in terms of share of energy consumed across the industrial sector, non-ferrous metals has a very small share. The largest sector, in terms of share, consuming around 40% of industrial energy, is iron steel sector. Now, if we look at the PAT targets, using the PAT threshold of 30,000 TOE per year, the PAT is only able to cover less than 40% of the total sector's energy. This is one of the primary reasons why PAT efficiency improvements are not been reflected. So one major limitation towards extending the PAT targets and cover the entire industries is if you move higher up, the incremental energy consumption covered by increasing number of factories becomes very marginal. And as a result of that, it increases your transaction cost significantly. Now, one possible way to reduce that is to promote policies that incentivizes or promotes switch to more cleaner source of energy for the industrial sector, especially when we are seeing the carbon intensity of the entire industrial sector remain invariant in the period. Thank you. Over to you, Marlene.
Thanks, Tirtha. Yeah. Next, we invite Nikhil Kolse-Patil of IGLAI South Asia to present an analysis of the waste sector. Nikhil Kolse-Patil plays a key role in implementation of energy and climate mitigation projects at IGLAI. Nikhil has diverse experience in the development of GHG inventories at the state and city level. He is a certified urban GHG inventory specialist under World Bank City Climate Planner Certificate Program. Nikhil has managed the preparation of national and state level emission estimates and analytical publications on behalf of IGLAI, the waste sector lead under the GHG India Platform Initiative. Over to you, Nikhil.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be giving some insights on the waste sector and the three subsectors that are there within that. That's solid waste, domestic wastewater, and industrial wastewater. Next slide, please. So in terms of the overall estimation, the emissions from the waste sector are around 97 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and the major contributor is we've seen that it's domestic wastewater all through the time period considered. Industrial wastewater contributes to around 1/4 of the emissions, and solid waste makes about 12%. In terms of the growth, industrial wastewater, we've observed that the growth rate of emissions is the highest in that, and followed by solid waste disposal. Again, here there have been challenges in terms of gaps of information. So some of this is also dependent on the data that we have used for the estimation. in terms of the overall trend of the waste sector as such, the trend is quite steady all across the period, and we've seen a growth of around 4.2 CAGR. And emissions have overall grown by 1.5 times as compared to 2005 when you're looking at 2050. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of gas-wise emissions, so domestic wastewater, when it's discharged into open water bodies, that produces some amount of N2O emissions. So that's a small portion of the emissions, mainly from the waste sector. CH4 emissions dominate and make up about 75% of the emissions. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of how the waste sector fares with regards to emission intensity, so that is something we've looked at, and overall we've seen that the emission intensity cumulatively has decreased by 22%. So that basically aligns with our national targets that we have under the NDC, and year on year we've seen a change of around 2.4%. In terms of per capita emissions, these are rising. So per capita, the population growth per year has been around 1 to 1.5% in that range in this period, and the emissions are rising at a faster rate. But there are also some of the drivers that we think will also lead to further reduction in the emission intensity, particularly or overall in the rate of growth of emissions. I'll get to that in the next two slides. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of solid waste, one interesting observation that we got out of the analysis was for solid waste, when you're computing emissions, you have to go back to a period 50 years before the starting point. So we had to estimate emissions right from 1950s. And one interesting point that came out is based on the changing waste composition in India across cities. So that has impacted the emissions that are generated by every ton of solid waste. That's increased by around 2.6 times. So that presents a challenge and an opportunity as well. And we have also seen that based on the Swachh Bharat mission, if you do an analysis, currently there's a large gap in processing of solid waste. Only around 15% of municipal solid waste in the country is processed, and the rest goes to disposal sites. So, but given the targets in the Swachh Bharat mission, so if those targets are achieved, the trend of emissions is completely reversed. Also, given that we have got an increasing trend, but as I said earlier, there are some challenges in the data. So in terms of availability of information on solid waste, its processing, that's intermittent, and that's why it is somewhat challenging to capture the impacts accurately. But overall, the main takeaway here is given the focus that has been put on segregation and processing of organic waste in particular through programs like the Swachh Bharat mission. So the trend is that the emissions will, if the activity thereon continues, the emissions will also show reduction. Next slide, please. In terms of wastewater emissions from domestic sector, that's from households, we looked at urban and rural areas. And mainly for the domestic wastewater, the emissions are largely dependent on the wastewater treatment and conveyance systems. So based on the how much percentage of the population uses a particular system, like septic tanks, like STPs, sewer lines. So depending on that, there's a emission factor assigned, or there's an emission factor specified for each, and the emission will depend on that. So what we observed is urban per capita emissions from domestic wastewater, particularly, they are slightly higher than rural. So that the main driver here is again because in rural areas, there's a lot of untreated discharge, and in terms of GHG emission, that has a lower emission potential. But of course, there are other impacts as well. If you're just plainly looking at untreated discharge of water, wastewater, sorry. And that's why, considering urban emissions are higher, that is also happening because when you convey wastewater through two STPs, through two sewage treatment plants like aerobic, anaerobic treatment plants, there is a higher methane generation, but then that also gives an opportunity for methane capture. And that is the main opportunity that is also there to decarbonize emissions from both industrial and domestic wastewater. There is a need to focus on CH4 recovery and also anaerobic treatment, which can enable these mitigation actions. Thank you. I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Nikhil. I now invite Dr. Raman Mehta of Vasudha Foundation to present his insights from the agriculture, forestry, and other land use or the FOLU sector. Over to you, Dr. Raman. Dr. Raman Mehta is a program policy head at Vasudha Foundation, New Delhi. He has worked on different facets of sustainable development, climate change, and natural resource management. He currently focuses on issues relating to equity in the context of climate change, integration of climate change concerns into development strategies, and how to overcome barriers in accelerating the deployment of renewable energy sources in the country. Over to you, Dr. Raman.
Thanks. So the story of the FOLU sector as opposed to the other sectors is that overall the trends of emissions from the FOLU sector are flat, in the sense that there is not much difference between the emissions in 2005 and 2015. If anything, emissions in 2015 are a little lower than emissions in 2005. So what you see in the FOLU sectors in terms of emission trends is a flat trajectory. And the three major contributors to positive emissions, or rather I should say two major contributors to the positive emissions from the FOLU sector, are the livestock sector and aggregate sources and non-CO2 emissions from land, which is primarily rice cultivation in India's case. While in terms of land or emissions from land, the primary sort of emission removal is being done by the forestry sector, and there are very small emissions from the other land use in India. Next slide, please. So in terms of the livestock sector, primarily again the main contributor to emissions in this sector is enteric fermentation, with the main driver there being a very large size of animal population in India. I think the Indian animal population is probably the largest in the world, and dominated by cattle, which are the primary sort of sources of enteric fermentation. What's happened over the years is that there's been a stagnation in the population of, in the livestock population of India, which is why you find that the enteric fermentation emissions are again flat. But there's been a long-standing sort of attempt, even for, not for climate sort of reasons, but for other environmental reasons, to try and limit flock sizes. But that's sort of not really been successful, and the schemes that have been deployed by the government have not succeeded in limiting flock sizes. Although growth of the animal populations has been stagnant between 2005 and 2015. Next slide, please. Like I had already pointed out earlier, that the land story in India is dominated by the fact that the forestry sector is a major CO2 remover, and that sort of overwhelms the very small amount of positive emissions coming from assorted land use in croplands, forestlands, grasslands, etc. What's notable about the forestry emissions in the Indian context is that they've again been fairly steady. If anything, if you rely on official figures, the carbon dioxide removal has gone up between, starting from 2014. But they've remained fairly steady through the reference period from between 2005 to 2015. Next slide, please. So, what we have in the in the trends that are again coming out, like again, the dominant story here is that stagnant emissions, fairly stagnant emissions, and a flat curve. The main contributor being rice, and the other sort of contributor being agriculture soils, primarily from fertilizer use. So those are the emissions that are getting captured from the category which is termed as agricultural soils. India, as you all know, is among the largest rice producers in the world. Fertilizer use has been, per acre fertilizer use is in India still fairly low, but it's been rising, and therefore a slight sort of growing trend of emissions from the agriculture soils. But in general, it's a fairly flat sort of picture. Now, in terms of the policy sort of implications, I think one aspect that needs to be pointed out is that India's emission intensity target that India proposed or put forth in Copenhagen of reducing energy emission intensity of the GDP, by 20 to 25% between 2005 and 2020, and then extended that to 2030 in the NDCs that were submitted to the Paris meeting of the UNFCCC, is that India explicitly stated that agriculture will be kept out of this particular offer at the international level. So there are no specific, as yet, policies that look at limiting emissions from agriculture, except perhaps you could say that there was the agriculture mission that was identified as a priority in the national action plan on climate change. But the agriculture mission subsequently was when it got operationalized, was a very, very small component, and it wasn't even titled that. Eventually, it was called the National Initiative on Climate Resilient Agriculture, and addressed a very small part of the whole problem relating to agriculture. The other mission, of course, was the Green India mission, and the Green India mission, as you all know, even the BUR, for example, admits that we are not on track to meet our commitments under the or our targets under the Green India mission. But I am not going into that in detail at the moment, because the publicly available information around the National Agriculture Mission is sort of not very clear, and therefore we haven't ventured to do an analysis of that at this stage. I think that's it. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Raman. The World Resource Institute has been the peer reviewer for this exercise. Subrata Chakrabarti from WRI will detail the reviewer's perspective on methodology and approach for this exercise. Subrata is a manager with the climate program at WRI. He primarily works on the GHG platform India. His role includes reviewing the methodology notes and estimates for various sectors such as the FOLU, energy, industrial energy use, and IPPU and waste. He also leads the data-related research for GHGDP and is also involved in the electric mobility work at WRI India. Over to you, Subrata.
Thanks. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are.
Thanks. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have enjoyed so far the key insights that our partners have provided for each key economic sectors. WRI India is involved as a technical advisor and peer reviewer to this platform. And as a part of our role, we sort of developed a framework for GHG estimates, which basically involves preparation of guidance document in line with the internationally accepted guidance and the reporting templates, which is consistent with the reporting requirements, of UNFCCC. Next slide, please. So basically, why should we care about GHG estimates? And if you understand, the viewership of the GHG estimates is basically not geographical profile, and when it is not really limited to a country's geographical profile, it warrants few questions, which are basically whether the GHG estimates are credible and transparent, whether it fulfills the requirements of reporting as per UNFCCC. Where does the country lacks information to create robust GHG estimates and support policy decisions? What are the priorities for research and measurement? Any scientific uncertainties in the emissions? So these are few questions which basically requires a third-party review. Next slide, please. So as per the decision 17th of 8th session of COP, each non-next party needs to communicate inventory of anthropogenic emissions by source and removal by sinks of all greenhouse gases, which are not controlled under Montreal Protocol. So GHG estimates that are prepared under this platform informs the national government, which can help meet the reporting requirement internationally. It also helps in building sort of national capacities and capabilities by bringing out the improvement areas in the inventorization. It also helps with the regular preparation of biannual reports in accordance with the relevant decisions under UNFCCC process. As it has already been mentioned that GHG platform India and its analysis have been recognized in the second BUR of India, which is an official submission by Government of India to UNFCCC. Next slide, please. So based on how we did, understanding the importance of consistency in reporting, we sort of devised a guidance document and a reporting template by creating a GHG matrix, which is further divided into two parts. As you can see from the slide, national and subnational, as well as sectoral. And then we identified the components for each part and came up with the guidance, and these are reduced as far as practicable. We use consistent accounting approaches, data collection methods, included all significant GHG greenhouse gases, sources, and sinks in the GHG assessment boundary, and we particularly disclosed and justify any specific exclusions, ensured common methodologies, data sources, assumptions, etc. And we used publicly available data and the recent data and updated our estimates in light of the new credible sources. Next slide, please. So this slide basically explains as to how the review process works under GHG Platform India. So all the partners submit their GHG emissions along with the methodology note, which transparently mentions the methodology adopted to calculate GHG emissions, trend analysis along with the supportive documents. These documents go through a routine check, what we call it as first layer review. This is a first extensive check of activity data, emission factor, and underlying assumptions, and identify potential improvements, which is then communicated to the sector leads. Once we receive the revised documentation with improvements, it goes for second layer review, which is an independent technical review. If there is any further room of improvements, it goes for another round of iteration with the sectoral leads and the team. The revised and the improved document, after satisfactory peer review process, then goes to the editorial check before finalization and uploading at the GHG official website, GHGPI official website. Next slide, please. So to paint an accurate picture of GHG estimates, it is important to have more stratified activity data, country or plant specific emission factors. But there are few key source categories, like electricity generation, etc. State-wise data for higher tier as per IPCC is not available in the public domain. So data accessibility is again an issue. There are data that are necessary but not available at the desired level of segregation. And all these other points actually boils down to two common things. One is the need to have institutional arrangement for data collection, and second, capacity building. So the national GHG estimates is basically more than just a part of national communication. It should be viewed more as an analytical tool which could inform on appropriate policy measures to be taken in order to achieve national climate goals, and also to track the progress of the climate policies. There are a lot of discussions around the data sets that are used to determine GHG estimates at the national and subnational level. We at platform level like to quantify the uncertainties associated with activity data and the emission factor going forward. We would also like to approach adopting higher tier methods to refine our GHG estimates further, and would like to get involved with external sectoral experts as well. We'd very much like to conduct this technical assessment of GHG estimates in line with the UNFCCC guidelines. Last but not the least, a quality GHG estimates basically informs the reader and make him understand the assumptions and the calculations. I guess that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Subrata, and all the panelists. We now open the webinar to questions from the audience. Please direct questions to the panelists using the Q&A chat window. The first question we have is directed to Tirtha. You mentioned that coal-based production in key industrial sectors has been a major driver for industrial emissions. Given the profile of India's iron and steel industry, what is the scope of electrification and cleaner processes in the future?
Hi. So, posing the question. So I want to start with, if let's say you divide the iron steel sector into two broad sectors, like let's say iron making and steel making. Now, if you look at the recent technologies, so steel making in India is electrified. So you have electric arc furnaces and you have induction furnaces, whereas the iron making process is heavily driven by coal, which is primarily your blast furnaces, which are typically the characteristics of an integrated steel plant, followed by the DRI, which is again producing sponge irons. Typically, these are small scale and often belong to the medium and small scale industries as well. So, given the per capita levels of steel that India consumes today, it's highly likely that we need more fresh iron, processed iron, to be pumped into the economy. That brings us to the question that how can we, or what are the pathways to decarbonize, or let's say switch to low carbon iron making? So as of now, the typical processes that have been explored are gas, which did not pick up much in India because of our priorities and pricing strategies. So yes, we need to have revive the gas-based plants. Following by this, Tata Steel uses a very low, typical technology which uses a cyclone, a dense media cyclone to convert iron into to reduce iron ore and into iron. It's called a Helsana process. So it's typically used currently in Norway, but whereas in India it's yet to be tested out. That also kind of leaves a room for potential testing and kind of looking at feasibility whether it used in Indian applications. And finally, if you look at how European Union and Japan's transition to is a hydrogen-based economy, more than 3 pilot projects are looking at whether you can use hydrogen to reduce iron to produce steel. So even CEW has done a very initial assessment, mostly looking at the techno-economic feasibility of a hydrogen-based iron steel production process. Yeah, thank you. Anyways, I'll be happy to take more questions offline if you have any specific questions regarding those processes. Yeah, over to you, Merlin.
Thanks, Tirtha. There is a follow-up question. Did you consider emissions of fluorinated gases from IPPO categories, fluorochemical production 2B9, electronics production 2E, or ODS substitutes 2F in your IPPO estimates? If yes, what were your sources of data?
No, our scope was limited only to CO2, CH4, and N2O. We did not include those F gases in the emission estimates.
Okay, thank you. The next question, what is the typical percentage of residue burning in India, especially in major crops such as paddy, wheat, cotton, and groundnuts? No, they haven't specified anybody, but I guess Vasudha Foundation can answer this question. Dr. Raman?
Sorry, I was on a mute this thing. Sorry. Yeah, so thanks for the question, Suresh. The first thing about residue burning is that there are no surveys or there is no officially collected data of the proportion of crop residues that are burnt in India. There are some expert studies that have been done, and the 2 studies that we have relied on are Gadde et al. And Jan et al. And from these 2 studies, basically the estimates that come out are that in Punjab, Haryana, UP, and Himachal Pradesh, around 23% of the wheat residues are burnt, while in the rest of the country, about 10% of the wheat residues are burnt. For rice, the country average for residue burning is 20%, and for cotton, the residue burning is about 10%, and this is for the whole country. And these scientists have made certain assumptions on the basis of which they came up with these numbers. I don't think we have any figures for groundnut residue burning. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Raman. Next question is also directed to Dr. Raman. Can you please elaborate on why rice production in specific has higher emissions in comparison with any other food grains?
Well, so primarily rice cultivation results in methane emissions. And this is, again, typically emissions that arise out of conventional transplanted rice in flat land, where again typically farmers tend to flood their fields and keep them sort of filled with water through the crop cycle. And so when the plant matter in a field sort of decays in the water, then that gives rise to methane emissions. So that's the reason why you have emissions from rice cultivation. My side.
Thank you, Dr. Raman. Next question. How can one include below ground microbial processes for GHG accounting for agricultural soils? I'm not sure who this question is directed to.
No, I think it's for me.
Okay.
So I think, the problem is that in a lot of these cases, there isn't enough primary scientific work that has been done to estimate, what is the level of below ground microbial sort of matter. for agriculture soils. The second part of it is that in very heavily, for example, if you're looking at cropland and heavily cultivated cropland, a lot of the microbial matter tends to sort of die out because of application of fertilizers and pesticides and so on and so forth. Below ground, although what I must say is that the Forest Survey of India estimates below ground biomass when they do inventory of forest sort of carbon dioxide removals by the forest by forests. But I'm not sure whether there are any primary studies or primary studies that are in the public domain that are looking at this particular aspect specifically.
Thank you. The next question is also not directed to anyone specific. Does collecting information about emissions include information about the utility of emissions, economic value generated, GDP contribution per unit emissions, etc., for different activities or sectors? How far are we from such a system? Would either Vasudha or WRI like to take up this question?
Yeah, I can take this on. So, you see, the point is that there is a whole lot of estimation that is being done about the utility or economic value of the specific economic activities that are being carried out. So, for us to estimate that also would be sort of reinventing the wheel. So, for example, just to give you an example, India has a pretty extensive system of estimating its GDP and its GDP growth and so on and so forth from economic activity. So, what we are looking at is trying to complement those efforts and trying to estimate GHG emissions arising out of those particular economic activities. And you can marry the two databases. So, for example, when we are putting out the numbers on emission intensity of India's GDP, that in a sense is a combination that comes out of our estimations of GHG emissions from economic activity and the GDP numbers that the government of India puts out. So, I hope that sort of answers your question.
Thank you. The last question, we have one last question. How can we estimate GHG emissions from subsectors of MSW? I think Ikle can answer this.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the subsectors, so I imagine this means the different processing pathways. So what we have included for now is emissions from disposal of MSW in disposal sites or landfills. So there is the IPCC methodology for all the organic constituents. There is a certain methane generation potential which you can estimate based on and use information on waste generation, its composition, and so on. For the other routes, basically, which is composting, biomethanation, and any other waste to energy technologies. So there are equations and there is calculation methodologies for that is available. We have not included that as of now, but that is mainly because of the data that is needed for this. It's not really available. Consistent and reliable data is not available in the Indian context on this. Also, given that waste to energy, we have seen it emerge only probably since 2012 or so, and even for that, the data that you need in terms of how much waste is processed in these different routes, that is still sketchy. But it is definitely possible. The IPCC also has, the IPCC guidelines also include the methodology for this. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you all of you for joining us today. A special thanks to our panelists. You can find more information on the work by GHG Platform India on info@ghgplatform-india.org or write to the secretariat @ghgplatform india-india.org. The email IDs and links are available on the presentation on the screen. Do write to us. Thank you all for joining us.